All right. Just having a Sapporo. It's a beer from Sapporo, from Hokkaido. Tastes very similar to every other fucking Japanese beer. You know, it's okay. Mama. So. Anyway, we were, I think, still working the cap. We were, in the last video, we were talking about structural plasticity and how you can strengthen the connections between cortical columns by increasing the number of synapses from the axon of one pyramidal cell to the basal dendrites or other dendrites of another pyramidal cell, which basically doubles the EPSPs that are generated in the dendrites and thus increasing the chance that the postsynaptic cell will generate an action potential, that it will reach the threshold potential and thus generate an action potential. So that's one way of doing it. But there's other ways. Without resorting to actually increasing the number of synaptic connections, you can actually strengthen a single connection. Interesting. So how does one achieve this? Well, let's think about it. And in order to think about it clearly, we should probably revisit the old synapse. So let's have a look at the synapse. So this diagram now, which should bring back terrible memories. No, not at all. It should be memories of joyful learning. So this is the action. No, this is the synapse. And all of this is all very, very familiar to you. Now you have the action potential here, which triggers the release of neurotransmitter from synaptic vesicles. So the neurotransmitter shown in yellow here, released across the synaptic cleft and binds to these postsynaptic receptors. Now, here is the question, what are these postsynaptic receptors? Well, there are a number of different types, but when we're talking about these kind of wiring connections between a pre and a postsynaptic cell, we are normally talking about what? Yes, we're talking about, I don't think the black works here. Let's go for a white. We're talking about AMPA receptors. So let's revisit a little bit about AMPA receptors. So what do AMPA receptors do? So we've got a postsynaptic membrane, right? Kind of looks like that. Actually, let me undo that because I'm going to draw two postsynaptic. So we've got, I'll draw it like this. I haven't drawn it this way before, but I will this time. So this is postsynaptic. So the neurotransmitter's coming in this direction. And in the postsynaptic membrane, we've got what? We've got AMPA receptors, right? And they kind of look like this. Why do they look like this? Because they're channels, yeah? They're channels. And they are what kind of channels? They are ligand-gated channels. What is the ligand for the AMPA receptor? You should know this. It is glutamate, of course. So glutamate binds to a ligand binding site on the AMPA receptor. Should I label that for you? Yeah. Please do, Andrew. Done. This is the AMPA receptor. And glutamate binds, the receptor channel opens up, and what enters, what goes through? Yes, sodium ions go in, down their concentration gradient, and of course it is the flow of sodium ions of course carrying positive charge that causes the, I'll draw it down here, membrane potential, the EPSP, yeah? So this little EPSP that you're seeing here is it represents the flow, or is the flow of positive charge that comes from these sodium ions. So how might we increase the strength of the synapse? Well, how about like this? Let's draw the synapse again. Right. This time, I'm going to increase the number of AMPA receptors. Now, what effect is this going to have? We basically doubled the number of AMPA receptors. Now, of course, it's not really 2 and 4. There's many AMPA receptors, about 100 or so on each postsynaptic membrane. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But we've doubled the number of AMPA receptors. So that means now that, so in this case, the first case, when glutamate binds, you've got a limited number of AMPA receptors, which means that you've got a limited amount of sodium that can flow through these AMPA receptors. However, if you increase the number of AMPA receptors, and there are, this is something that you increase the number of AMPA receptors, you can increase the amount of sodium that flows through the AMPA receptors. It's not a difficult concept at all. Yeah? So what is the EPSP going to look like in this case? 0. So twice as much sodium means twice as much current. So positive charge flows, twice as much positive charge flows into the cell, so the EPSP is going to be twice as large. Brilliant. So this is a very simple way of, and one of the most important ways of strengthening a synapse. Okay, so we've now covered 2 ways of strengthening a synapse. So strengthening 2 techniques, methods for strengthening the connection between columns. One, structural plasticity by doubling the number of synapses, and another one is by strengthening an individual synapse, which one of the ways you can do it, that's not the only way, one of the ways you can do it is by increasing the number of AMPA receptors, for example. Okay, so let's crystallize these concepts for your own benefit, to crystallize your understanding of these concepts by looking at the consequences of this on the EPSPs and relating that to the probability that a postsynaptic neuron will fire. Okay, anyway, this will become clear. So this is a diagram which is kind of pretty old now, from a much earlier unit. You have the action potential and the presynaptic triggers either an EPSP or sometimes an IPSP in some types of synapses. We're not going to look at IPSPs, but everything really also applies to kind of these inhibitory synapses as well, but we're only looking at EPSPs, so excitatory connections. So these are glutamate connections between synapses. So the presynaptic cell triggers an EPSP in the postsynaptic cell, and of course, whether or not the postsynaptic cell itself fires an action potential depends upon whether the sum of all of these EPSPs arriving on all of its dendrites reach the threshold potential, thus triggering an action potential. Okay, so let's now draw 2 of these connections, but we'll have a strong one and a weak one. And you now understand what I mean by a strong one and a weak one, yes? This is, of course, the strong one with a thick arrow. So this is a strong connection. So this could mean there's more AMPA receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And this is a weaker connection. And to make this, to make it clear what the effect is of these strong and weak connections, let's look at the effect on the membrane potential. So first of all, we have the strong connection. So the membrane potential, which I'll draw in yellow, sits kind of at the resting potential, fluctuating a little bit. Then, let's say an action potential fires here in the presynaptic neuron, which then, after a short delay, of course, the delay across, a bit of a delay across the synapse for the neurotransmitter to diffuse. You then get a rather large EPSP, let's say, in the postsynaptic cell, which then decays. Why is it large? Well, we've said that this is a strong connection. Let's compare that then to the weak connection. Okay, so I will change colours here. We'll go with a light blue. So this is the weak connection. So again, action potential fires. And again, we'll say the action potential fires at the same time. So we can compare. What's the EPSP going to look like in the postsynaptic dendrite? Well, it's a weaker connection, so it's going to be a smaller EPSP. So overall, the stronger connection means that the EPSP has pushed the membrane potential closer. It's almost touching now the threshold potential. So all it needs is another EPSP to arrive on another dendrite, perhaps, in quick succession, and that's going to push it over, and you're going to get an action potential. Whereas in the case of this much weaker EPSP, perhaps you'd need 2 or 3 more EPSPs to actually push that membrane potential over the threshold. Great. So overall, a weak synapse is less likely to trigger an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, or you're going to need more action potentials across more weak synapses to actually push the membrane potential over the threshold potential, simply because you have to sum up all of these kind of quite small EPSPs in order to get the membrane potential over that hurdle, over the threshold potential, to trigger an action potential. Whereas when you have strong synapses, you might sometimes only need a single, in some cases, with very strong, powerful synapses, you only need a single EPSP, and that will push the membrane potential over the threshold, and the postsynaptic neuron will fire. So hopefully now it's pretty clear to you what we mean by strong and weak connections, what we mean by strong and weak synapses, and thus what we mean by strong and weak connections between pyramidal cells, and thus what we mean finally by strong and weak connections between cortical columns. Great. Okay, so let's now go back to our diagram, our simple 12-column diagram that we've been working on in this unit with these kind of fresh eyes. So here we go. So here we've got our 6 columns, and let's say, so 6 columns, I'm saying 6, 12 columns, and you can now see that there are strong connections between these columns, and the dotted lines show the weak connections, and now you understand exactly what that means. So let's say that again that 2 of these columns are activated. Well, what does that mean they're activated? Well, they're firing action potentials. They're sending action potentials where? Well, they're sending action potentials here. Let's take specifically, I think, let's take this cortical column. So when this cortical column's pyramidal cells fires, where is it sending its action potentials? Well, it's sending its action potentials to columns to which it is connected, right? What columns is it connected to? Well, of course it's connected to this column. Here, I should change colour again. That's a yellow. Of course it's connected to this column, but of course it's also connected to this column and to this column in this diagram. But which column is most likely to be activated by this column? Well, you need to think about the strength of the connections. You've got weak connections here. These are weak. and this is a strong connection. And we know that strong connections means that the EPSP is larger, the EPSPs are larger, and thus that it's more likely that you're going to get action potentials in the postsynaptic cells. In other words, more likely you're going to get activation of this column, whereas activation of these columns are much less likely, unless this is super active and and strongly kind of firing. So this is the most likely result of these two initial columns firing. What's most likely to happen, for reasons that we have discussed at some length, is that the strong connections will mean that this particular pattern of activation of the cortical columns results. So where are we? Where are we? So now we understand not only that cortical columns are connected, we now understand how they're connected via these synaptic connections between pyramidal cells, and these connections between these pyramidal cells can be strengthened and weakened, and that stronger connections means that it's more likely that action potentials arriving from the presynaptic side are more likely to trigger activation of pyramidal cells or action potentials in pyramidal cells on the postsynaptic side, which means that it's more likely, in other words, that this column will activate the other column, basically the presynaptic column. It's not really correct, but it works. This presynaptic column will activate this kind of column on the postsynaptic side because of the summing of these much larger EPSPs. Whereas with the weak connections, it's much less likely that they will be activated. So that's a much more realistic way of looking at this connectivity, based upon the strength of these synaptic connections. Okay, I think that's enough for this video. What I want to do in the next video is go a little bit further with this. Talk a little bit more about the strength of these connections, and we might even get towards thinking about what happens when you start depolarizing these neurons with 5-HT2A receptor activation, for example. But that might be a couple of videos off yet. Splendid. I'll see you next time. Next video. Next time. Peace out.